This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, thanks, Yusuf, for the words. So yeah, today I'll be talking about pre and post-harvest management in apple, focusing on a Norwegian perspective, kind of giving some insight into the fact that yes, we can grow apples in Norway and how we grow them. And there will be a sufficient amount of beautiful pictures to just show off a little bit. So just so you're aware. This is like right outside my office.
Really?
Or pretty close to, yeah, it's in my town. It's pretty epic. So just a kind of general brief overview. I'll give an overall background of a little bit about Norway and my institute in general, and then fruit growing in Norway, tie it into explaining a little bit about the climate of Norway and how that impacts growing, and then specifically how it impacts post-harvest, certain disorders, since that's what I focus on. And then tying in some new cultivars that we've just had and how that impacts post-harvest research, how that impacts my research, and leading that into my PhD, and essentially, why am I even at Cornell? So I was going to talk about me, but Yusuf pretty much did that. So I'm from Maine. I want that to be said. I'm not Norwegian, full-on American. Went to undergrad here, worked for a couple of years in Western New York, and then decided I needed to learn how to do research properly. So I did a master's also in Norway because I wanted more cold and more winter. So I was like, let's go to Norway. And then I found out they had fruit, they had apples, and I decided to stay. So I did my thesis at NIBIO, the institute that I work at now. And now, as part of my position as a scientist, I am doing a PhD in partnership with NIBIO, my university in Norway, and now with Cornell as well. So that's kind of the overall connection. So I also don't expect everyone to have a grasp of where Norway is and why this is impactful. But basically, Norway is like way up here, way at the tippity top. It's about the same. I'm about the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska. But because of the Gulf Stream, it's warmer than in Anchorage, so we can grow more things, and we can grow apples commercially, whereas in Alaska they couldn't necessarily. So that's just the general context of why I can even be working on apples in Norway. Generally, my institute is it's kind of this combination of extension and USDA and all this different culminations of applied agricultural research. So it's a fairly large institute. It's the 750 employees over 15 different stations, positioned in different spots to focus on whatever commodity is grown or produced there. So we have a lot of aquaculture up north and Arctic sciences. We have a lot of grasslands and forestry in the middle. And then the Big Apple near me is my research station, which focuses just on fruit. And as you can see, Norway is super long. There's a lot of, it's really ragged, jagged coastline. There's very little arable land. Only 3% of the country is arable. So there's some unique challenges just based on the geography. If we zoom in on my station, so this is, these are some of our orchards. This big long building right here is our office building, and then down here we have a lab building with windows facing over the fjord. So our station has been around for 75 years. It was created to support fruit growers in the region, and we are right in the middle of one of the largest growing regions for apples in Norway. So it's a pretty strategic placement. We're 10 researchers and 8 technicians that work with every aspect of fruit research, from cultivar and rootstock selection all the way through post-harvest and cider production. We have a lot of collaboration both nationally and internationally with business and researchers, other researchers, and especially given the scale of Norwegian fruit production, I think we have pretty good infrastructure overall for fruit research. If we dig more into fruit industry in Norway in general, here in Norway, we classify it as fruit and berries. So fruit is like all tree fruit. So we do work on berries a lot too, because there is a lot of berry growing, but that's a different station. I don't work with it at all. So I'm just going to talk about tree fruit. So Norway, it's primarily apple, plum, cherry, and pear. It's pretty small acreage, 4,000 acres of apple total, but it's also a small country with 5 million people. So it doesn't need to be a ton. And there's this other impact of the northern latitude, obviously affecting the growing season and where we can grow the fruit. So if we look at the southern part of Norway, which is the only part of Norway where it's warm enough to grow fruit, we have 3 major growing regions, one right near Oslo, one in Telemark, right in the middle here, which if you ski, is where telemark skiing was originated, on one on the West Coast. And I work right here, so right in the middle of this section. And if you notice on the map, the big connector piece here is fjords or lakes, bodies of water. So as this picture shows, you're going right up to the fjord or the lake because you really need to take advantage of the moderated climate from the bodies of water to even be able to grow anything. But because it's all in fjords tend to be mountains that go straight, very steeply down into water. So that means we are often growing on really steep gradients, and you're growing wherever you can in whatever amount of space you can, right? So this is not uncommon where you see like 100 trees planted in between somebody's house and another house, because you're just using all the space that you can possibly get. But given that, I still think we have a fairly modern production system, right? We use normal trellis system. We try to plant north-south, but that's really directed by the slope. Sometimes you just have to plant however you can plant it. And even with that, sometimes you can't get a tractor up it, so you have to use an ATV, or we have these special sleds with treads on them that can hold 1 bin of apples. So it gets interesting. Everything is planted on M9 rootstocks. We import all our trees from the Netherlands for the most part. So that we also have been producing trees in the same, or apples in the same region since the 1200s. So obviously they haven't been on M9 forever, but the same areas have been used for growing apples for 800 years. So the fact that we're all using the same rootstock is kind of fascinating to me. There are a few chemical thinners used, and it's mostly hand thinning or no thinning. There's a couple reasons for this. It's often too cold to use for chemical thinners to be effective, but then it's also our largest, the apple that, our largest volume apple often gets too large if you thin it, is what the growers say. So we then go into a biannual year, or biannual bearing, but at least you have sellable fruit. We also have limited pesticides, especially compared to the US. It's similar to in the rest of the EU, but some pesticides, there's just not enough of a market of people who want them, so the companies don't want to register them in Norway. What I do think is kind of unique is that all our cherries are grown in tunnels to prevent rain cracking. So from June to July, half our fields are just covered in white plastic because there's so much rain that it's easy for the cherries to crack. So to commercially produce cherries, they have to be under tunnels. We don't use reflective fabric or tunnels or anything, or hail nets for anything else, but for cherries, we exclusively use tunnels.
Is that the single-use plastic for that season?
No, we try to reuse it a couple times. The plastic usually lasts like 5 to 10 years.
Is it left on the whole time, or is it on and off?
No, we take off the fabric in the winter, or in August, really. So it's only a couple months out of the year. and we obviously have it off for pollination as well. Overall, if we talk closer to harvest, we produce about 20,000 metric tons of apples per year. Generally from small orchards and family farms, again, because we have this long history, sometimes they've been in the same family for 600 years. And it's mostly co-op packing houses where the grower, like a number of growers deliver to the same packing house and own the packing house. Because of the small scale of farming, it's often part-time farming, so the growers will have another job on top of farming as well, which complicates things. And as I guess I previously mentioned, there's a lot of rain, so it often means that we're harvesting in the rain. In New York, if it rains one day, you're like, oh, well, I'll wait until the next day when the apple's dry to pick. If we did that in September in Norway, you would never pick a single apple because it rains every single day. So it's just something that we have to deal with. You learn to love the rain, and you know it affects the apples. In the past 30 years, the strategy for apple production has been to sell it as fast as possible. Basically, get everything out before the beginning of December. We have taxes on imported apples until December 1st. So that's the only time that Norwegian apples have historically been competitive in the market. However, Norway wants to be more self-sustainable right now. It is currently one of the least self-sustainable countries in the world. And fruit is one of the ways it can be self-sustainable in fruit, at least in apples. So there's a bigger focus on trying to increase both the quality during the current selling season of Norwegian apples and extend the season. So there's this renewed interest in post-harvest all of a sudden in Norway. At the same time, there's also a resurgence in the cider industry. It seems to me like a very similar trend to what's been happening in New York the past 10, 15 years, with lots of on-farm sales, lots of marketing, lots of like, look at how lovely this product is. And it really is quite great. It's a similar style, I think, to New York style cider. So it's really helped the industry a lot. But I thought I'd talk specifically about the weather, so we'll go into that. And this is just the reminder again that everything is due to the Gulf Stream. So I want to directly compare Ithaca and my region of Norway. So for the next few graphs, Norway will be in green and Ithaca will be in purple. So the graph on the left is the average temperature throughout the year. And what I think is interesting here is the high temperature in Norway during the growing season is about the same, a couple degrees warmer than the low temperature in Ithaca. So it never gets warm in Norway. The sun makes it feel warm, but degrees-wise, it never gets very warm. So obviously this impacts growing degree days. So this is growing degree days based on a 10-degree scale. And here, Norway gets about half the growing degree days in a season as Ithaca gets. That has a big impact on what we can grow. And this is right on a fjord too, right? Like the most optimal conditions that you can get for growing in Norway. But one of the things everybody knows about Norway, if you know something about Norway, is the midnight sun, the long daylight hours, and the long night hours in the winter, right? So if there's so much light, maybe that has an impact on, or it can help increase the growing season, even if the temperatures are low, right? And based on this graph on the left, which is the hours of daylight, there's 4 hours more daylight during most of the growing season in Norway than in Ithaca. But the graph on the right is the incident radiation, right? So what actually would hit the tree. And what you notice here is that it's always lower in Norway than in Ithaca, even though we have 4 hours more daylight per day in Norway. And the question there, my question immediately was why? And that brings me back to it's always raining in Norway. And it really is. So this is average monthly precipitation. And what you can see is the lowest month for precipitation in Norway still has more precipitation than the most you'll get in Ithaca on average. So it really is always raining in Norway. And then during the Norwegian growing season, which is May 1st to September 30th, Ithaca gets 64 days of rain. Norway gets 104. So within a 5-month period, we have more than a month more days of precipitation. So it really is always raining. That has to affect fruit quality. The plus side is we get awesome rainbows and we get our own Taganic Falls look-alike in my town. So some perks, but we're focusing on apples. So if we then go into what apples we actually grow, we primarily have 5 different cultivars, Aroma being this one being the main variety, but we also grow Discovery, Red Gravenstein, Summer Red, and Rubenstep. And we harvest in late August through early October. These were completely unknown varieties to me before I moved to Norway. And there's a reason for that, is that they're all really summer varieties. So for context, we have a rootstock planting of Gala that ripens in early to mid-October. In New York, that's early to mid-September, right? So there's a month difference. So it's really debatable if we can even commercially grow Gala because it's on the edge of our growing season. So that's why we only have summer varieties for the rest of the world and why our varieties aren't necessarily relevant historically to the rest of the world. As for storage, as stated, our late season storing varieties really aren't late season. They're mid-season at best. They're Gala comparatives. Gala can generally be stored for like 8-9 months in optimal conditions. And that's what we're seeing with our storage varieties as well. We also see, because a lot of them are early season varieties, that they lose firmness really quickly, which is typical of summer varieties, right? You pick them and they're soft if you look at them. And then to complicate everything, 1-MCP, which is super common ethylene inhibitor, right, used in the US commercially for 25 years, was just approved last year in Norway. So we're catching up at a rapid pace to the trends, but we have some setbacks that we've been working with. And another setback there is that we generally harvest the fruit too ripe for long-term storage, in part because of the tradition of just sell the fruit as fast as possible, and you want the nicest fruit if you're selling it right away. So you harvest it late. However, we still sell the earliest pick fruit first, and that's the best fruit for storage. And then we end up storing the late harvested fruit, and that's the worst fruit for storage. So there needs to be this like reconstruction of how people think about how to store fruit. We also have harvest requirements that aren't based on storage, they're based on direct sale. And then we have this really long harvest window where growers are allowed to harvest for 3 to 4 weeks. And we have the compounding factor of fruit being in the rain. We also don't have internal defect sorters on packing lines. We have external ones. So anything on the outside we can sort out. But if there's any browning or anything wrong inside, we can't see it. So we don't actually know how big of a problem internal disorders are. And just really quickly to emphasize the loss of firmness, this is in Aroma, our main cultivar, which is a mid-season variety in Norway, but according to the gene bank, or the, according to Geneva, it ripens in August 25th. So pretty early season. This green line is the requirement it needs to be at packing for firmness level, which is 5 kilos. At harvest is usually 6 to 7, and it loses that by about 6 weeks of storage. And we're trying to store it for 9 weeks optimally with some firmness left during shelf life, which it clearly doesn't have. So 1-MCP application and CA help, but we don't know for how long. It's never going to be a 6-month storage variety. To complicate that, bringing in the disorders finally, we also get soft scald on it, which is a really common chilling injury, common on Honeycrisp as well. And we have ways to mitigate it that are similar to how you mitigate it in Honeycrisp. But in Honeycrisp, you can condition it for 7 days at 10 degrees, and then bring it down to a cooler temperature. But with aroma, it gets soft so fast that you can't do it. So you have to debate if you want soft scald or you want soft fruit. And that's kind of what we have to, that's the constant debate we have to work with. And there is some evidence that growing season seems to affect it and weather seems to affect it, but there's no consistent indications of that. The other common disorder of Honeycrisp, so Honeycrisp, it's often soft scald bitter pit, are talked about. So we do have bitter pit, but it's not at significant levels. You see it also in aroma as you do soft scald, and calcium sprays generally work, but it's hard to find scientific proof that they work. And there is variation between seasons, which is what we see in New York, but it's just never at high amounts. It's like 5% is a high year for bitter pit. So my question is, I think it's just not warm enough in Norway. It could also be cultivar susceptibility, but I think it's just the temperatures are never warm. The calcium can be distributed into the fruit for a longer portion of the growing season. It's not as much of an issue. That's I don't have hard evidence for this, but this is just my general train of thought and some positive to the cold growing season, perhaps. We have also seen a rise in other lenticel disorders that are not bitter pit. This is a variety. It's hard to decide what is what, but generally we've seen more in recent years, which could be linked to climate change and a slightly warming climate and a wetter climate. But it's just a general observation right now. Norway has decided to follow the trends of the rest of the world recently, in that because we have no variety that's really, really good for storage, we need something that's better, that can be stored better, and we also need something that's crispier, juicier, sweeter, attractive to the new consumers, right? So we need a Honeycrisp type of apple in Norway. So the largest distributor decided to choose two crossings from the Netherlands and start planting those. So they both have the same two parents, SQ159, which is a Dutch variety, and Honeycrisp. And one of them is called Eden in Norway. It's red and orange, pretty, firm, crunchy, super sweet. That's the one thing you taste is sweet. And then the second is Fried, which is your more classic looking variety, firm, crunchy, sweet, but more balanced flavor. You taste it, or I taste it and think this tastes like Honeycrisp. So it's great that we have new varieties that can attract a different consumer base. However, following the trend can have consequences, as we might be aware of. So there seems to be this equation where if you breed a new variety that has Honeycrisp parentage, it's often not tested enough and it often has problems once it's commercially planted. Norway has followed that same trend where you have a Honeycrisp parent, you have commercial planting, started without prior research. So for context, the oldest trees in Norway are 6 years old. The first commercial production year was 2020, and that was the first year we could start research on these trees. So that has led to biannual bearing, unsurprisingly. This picture is extreme. I wanted to show it, but it does happen. And also lots of disorders. So the two common things that you get with this equation. So that's been great for my research, at least, because it gives me two things that are relevant across at least the post-harvest industry across the world. So the two things I'm looking at in my research are core browning and water core. So core browning, just super briefly, is often worse in cold climates, so that might be part of why we see it here. We see it in both Eden and Fried, but it's also seen in Honeycrisp and Evercrisp, which is that's a Honeycrisp and Fuji offspring. And so what I think is really interesting here is that Eden and Fried seem to have different causes of core browning, despite being so similarly related. So Eden, it seems to be very senescent related, and Freed, it seems to be a variety of factors influencing it, not one factor directly causes it. And that's the same with Honeycrisp and Evercrisp, is that that's this interesting like combination of factors all adding up to disorder incidence. So I think the discrepancies within similar cultivars is fascinating to me. And then water core is technically a pre-harvest disorder, but it's excess sorbitol accumulation in the intercellular space. And we have seen it historically in Norway, but it's only been very stress-related water core, which is very externally visible. So you can pick it out on packing lines. So it's not really a big problem necessarily. Ironically, it's related to heat waves and warm growing seasons in Norway, even though it never gets really hot. But it's warm enough that if it's warm near harvest, it will cause water core. However, Eden, one of the new varieties, gets a different type of water core called maturity water core. That happens mostly in the core and is not externally visible. And it is sometimes related to cool temperatures near harvest, aka the whole growing season in Norway, and increases with later ripening and later harvest date. And as the current marketing is that they want to pick this fruit really late, and when it's an orange background color, we get up to 76% water core at harvest in commercially picked fruit. So it's this big issue. And we see it also in Evercrisp, one of the Honeycrisp or Honeycrisp and Fuji cross. But in contrast, Eden is more problematic because the water core can turn brown within 2 to 3 weeks after harvest. So we really need to figure out how to prevent water core from the start in Eden. But I also want to see why it acts so differently in Eden and Evercrisp, even though they're related. So that brings me quickly to my thesis, which is a similar title to my talk today. Pre and post-harvest factors in relation to physiological disorder development for sustainable apple production. And it's in collaboration with NIBIO, Cornell, and NMBU. So what that means is I'm looking mostly at core browning and water core and trying to dig into the causes a little bit and the growing season and growing region factors that could impact disorder development. I won't necessarily go into all these points, but if I briefly go over the general methods just so it's understandable why I'm doing it here and why it's could be applied here. So for core browning, I'm looking at different storage temperatures, different storage treatments in all 3 varieties over multiple years to compare how the same treatments affect the fruit differently. And I'll dig into ethylene receptor gene expression as well, but it's mostly a applied storage trial to really try to understand why core browning in Eden is senescent and related and why it's not in Evercrisp and Freed, and how variety and growing season differences and growing region differences affect that. For water core, there's a couple different sections of this. I'm looking at water core development on the tree and near harvest at different harvest times in both Eden and Evercrisp, and trying to see if pattern development, like if incidence development is similar across the two. And if that affects a certain part of the sorbitol metabolism pathway in the same way or in different ways in the 2 varieties. And then I'm also doing kind of the reverse in storage because water core can go away in storage. The sorbitol can be taken up by the fruit. So then I want to see if this process happens similarly in the 2 cultivars, in Eden and Evercrisp. And then also if the gene expression in the metabolism pathway is kind of the reverse of at harvest. And on top of that, I want to look and see if you can, while here at Cornell, use some of the nano X-ray technology to see if you can track the same fruit through storage to watch the dissipation in one fruit over time and watch the sorbitol kind of go away in a way or be absorbed. And then the final part that's relevant to Cornell is I want to look at the effect of rootstocks on water core incidence and development. So this will be done at the two rootstock planting trials of Evercrisp in Geneva and Hudson Valley. Ideally with a couple different harvest timings and looking at differences in sorbitol accumulation, water core development, and then because it's in the two locations, looking at growing region differences. With the ultimate goal of eventually maybe this can be then applied in Norway with eventual rootstock plantings there. Yes, so that's what I had to say really about basically why I'm here, why my research could be at all relevant. And just wanted to end with my actual office views. I have a corner office, so I look out on these two views. And then this is my field office. And just a plug is we have a post-harvest pathology conference happening hopefully in spring 2026 in Norway. So if you want to see these views in person, you're welcome to come for them. And that's what I had. I guess it went away. Are there any questions?
Here
Yeah.
to field questions.
Emily, what are the soils like on the slope? It seems to be, there's not a whole lot of weathering, so.
Yeah, it's.
What?
Yeah, so Marvin's asking about the different soils. So they're very organic actually, because it's so cold that there is a lot of erosion at times because you can have landslides and avalanches and everything. But nothing decomposes really fast. So it's a really high organic matter soil. I don't know the other basis for the soils actually, and I maybe should. But
They're relatively deep. I mean, you have drainage issues.
yeah, they are. I think they are relatively deep. They work well enough. That's yeah. Yeah, there's one question in the chat from Thomas saying, is there any potential for newer varieties used in central Sweden? Like Rödluven, Silva, and Frederick? They're not known for storage. I haven't heard of any of those varieties actually. But we do often, most of our varieties actually come from Sweden. And we tend to grow the same things as in Sweden. So there is potential that we could use those as well. Yeah.
What about your rootstock? So you said in Norway it's 800 years of cultivation.
Yeah.
Okay, so how is it that in 2014 it seems like there's one rootstock that seems to be what's replacing? It seems pretty dangerous to have one rootstock. You would think over 800 years there would be some resistance that builds up, and so is there any effort to try to look for that and put that into the breeding line in future?
Yeah. So the question is about why we still use the same rootstock after, or yeah, why everything is grown on M9, even though we've been growing for 800 years, and how that impacts different resistance to diseases and such. And I would say, and if we're looking into it, so we do have rootstock plantings. We're part of the Eurofin network. And so we do look into different rootstocks, but the problem really is that commercially, because we have such low volumes, it's hard to ask for very specific varieties on very specific rootstocks. So I think that's a large part of why why we all have M9, is because we just can't get anything else other than just M9, because the nurseries don't want to offer us anything other than just M9. But hopefully we can steer away from that and towards a more variation in the rootstocks. Because it is dangerous to plant on the same ground for so long, for sure. Yeah.
So my question has a little bit of background, and it's that I'm from Ontario, Canada, where in the 1980s, the provincial government spent many millions of dollars paying grape growers to pull out cultivars that didn't work anymore, and then they gave them money to put in cultivars that work. So if there's 5,000 acres of apple trees in Norway, and all of these problems, such as the cultivars aren't right, and there's one rootstock and that sort of thing, has Norway, it would never happen here in the States, but has Norway considered just paying the growers to pull them all out and put in some robust cultivars?
Yeah, so the question's about why don't we just take out the cultivars that don't work and put in new ones, and the government pay for it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, government pay for it.
Or grower dollars as well. Right?
Yeah.
Struggling with these cultivars that don't seem to work.
That's what the 2 new cultivars were supposed to do. So there was this big push. Eden and Fried have been the 2 most highly planted cultivars ever, potentially. Like for Norway, it's a lot of trees planted. Right, they were supposed to bring along the new revolution, and it's not working so far. So because they didn't do enough testing. So I think that might go along eventually, but there's also this pushback where some people want the traditional varieties, even though they don't store well or anything, right? Because that's a Norwegian apple. A Norwegian apple is supposed to be soft. A Norwegian apple is supposed to smell like rock, because that's just the smell of Norwegian apples. So there's some back and forth. But I think in some ways it could be good to just kind of reset, but you have to have enough knowledge about the varieties that you're going to plant. And that was the key problem that we've learned now. So, yeah.
Yeah, great presentation. I guess my question is in regards to the biennial bearing habits.
Mhm.
So, from what I gathered from the presentation, that seems to be kind of the trend in the way that the orchard's managed. There's very little thinning, and if at all, it's hand thinning. Do you think that's going to be kind of an issue as climate change kind of becomes more prominent in the future, right? With late spring frosts, I'm just thinking if you're managing the orchard biennially, you have a frost event, right? Then your crop's going bye-bye, right? So
Yeah.
is there a crop insurance plan that the grower can buy into for that? How does that work?
Yeah. So the question was about different biennial, or how biennial bearing system essentially is going to be impacted by climate change. And there is crop insurance. We do have that. But I think there's definitely a push towards preventing biannual bearing. And there's a push towards more annual bearing. And I think that's going to be the solution, frankly, to biannual bearing and climate change is annual production. So it's just, and with the warming climate, chemical thinners will work better. So then it'll be easier, hopefully, to have an annual production system. But I think it's also just getting growers to understand the economic benefits of thinning. And some people get it and some people don't, or don't care enough. They're fine with what they have right now, and it works for them.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
You clarify the rootstock issue. What was the rootstock used by the Norwegian apple industry before 2014?
Yeah, so before 2019, or 2014, it was also still M9 that was used.
Oh,
So since we've been doing dwarfing rootstocks, it's been M9.
yeah, around for a long time.
Yeah, it was just before 2014, we weren't allowed to buy trees from other countries. We had to produce everything internally, and it was really expensive. So from 2014, it was allowed for us to buy it elsewhere.
By looking at the temperature, sort of the seasonal change of temperature, average temperatures,
Mhm.
the area where apples are grown in Norway, actually the temperatures are higher than Ithaca, right? During the winter.
Oh, during the winter, yes. Yeah, it's a much more stable climate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So cold damage or winter freezing damage is rarely an issue.
Yeah, it happens, but it's not a big problem for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just wondering a little bit more about the cider industry. Are they using these culinary varieties, or do they have different traditional varieties that they've been using for cider? Or are they bringing in varieties from other parts of Europe, or what's happening?
Yeah, so the cider industry is mostly based off of the dessert apples. So it's really big on single varietal ciders, actually. You do have blends, but there's also like marketing for like a specific aroma cider and a specific Gravenstein cider. They are bringing in British cider varieties as well, and bringing back some old traditional varieties. But most of it is left over from industry, like it's industry fruit, with some people growing specifically for cider.
That'll solve your post-harvest issue right there.
Yeah, it helps a lot. Yeah, it definitely does a lot for it.
So, Grant, what do you mean by culinary varieties? I thought those are fresh apples for fresh markets. Culinary means for cooking, right? For kitchen use. Like,
Well,
what
I don't know. The term culinary can mean fresh market or fresh eating, but I guess that's what I meant. The variety,
fresh eating.
the fresh market varieties, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of had a related question. How would you describe the average consumer there in Norway compared to like the US? Like, are they more sophisticated? Do they know varieties? They ask for varieties. You know, here they're, you know, are they, and how much do they eat relative to like, say, like typical American?
Yeah. So the average consumer in Norway does not know different varieties. Sometimes they know Norwegian variety, like one or two Norwegian varieties, but it's still like red, green, yellow apple a lot of the time. They also generally have, because we're at the end of the supply chain, the quality in general of our fruits and vegetables are lower, I would say, than in the US. So generally they're less picky, perhaps in some ways. At least I've had to become less picky when I'm there, but I'm not a traditional consumer either. I will qualify. But it's a very meat and potatoes country. So you have meat and potatoes for dinner with a side of vegetables. So it's also very like traditional crops still, right? Like very root vegetable based. But it's expanding. The consumer base is definitely getting more adventurous and trying more things and demanding more. So we're getting there. I think we're just like 10 years behind the US in trends. It's my guess. Yeah.
And you didn't mention imports. I presume there are imports and or not.
Yeah,
If
there's
there are, where are they coming from?
so our imports mostly come from Italy and Poland. But we also get stuff from New Zealand and Chile, depending on the season, obviously. But when possible, we try to be in Europe.
But you know, the question was, do consumers know their apples? Are they labeled by variety though?
Sometimes,
Okay.
normally when you have Norwegian apples, it's Norwegian red apples, this much per kilo. So the grocery stores aren't helping either, right? And like sometimes they separate out the Norwegian apples and they'll put like Norwegian flags up, and sometimes they don't. So there needs to be more work at the grocery store side of it too, right? And the distributor side of it to like really sell. But import apples are so cheap. So it just makes it easier to just sell import apples. So, yeah. Yeah.
Emily, with the very strict regulation for using pesticide and fungicide in Europe and Norway, right?
Mhm.
How you overcome the wet weather there, and what's also like during the pre-harvest and post-harvest, and what's the impact of the total amount of the production which can be consumed or go to the storage?
Yeah, so we don't really have a great way to overcome the impact of limited pesticides and the growing season and the wetness. So we get a lot of fruit rot. And we also can't apply pesticide or fungicides post-harvest. We can't apply anything post-harvest. We can't apply wax and like nothing. So there's a lot of, we try to use cultural methods, right? And try to be good about pre-sorting fruit when we can. And right now the big thing we've realized is that a lot of growers don't spray fungicides after July. So now we're trying to push for a spray of fungicides in August so that they actually work post-harvest. So I think that's the next step that will increase our storability a lot and increase our marketable fruit.
Okay,
We're good then?
thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.